Hello, I'm Will Meyer. I coordinate the programs in Anthropology-Archaeology and Gender Studies at Mercyhurst University. I have worked with many of you as co-organizer of QUAG, the Queer Archaeology Interest Group. I've also served on the SAA's Intersectionality Task Force and been a member of the Committee on Curriculum. I contributed to the organization's DEI review and development efforts, and I've been a member of the program committee for the last two national meetings. In November of 2023, I published a piece in the Archaeological Record calling on the SAA to step up its efforts on behalf of its queer, and especially on behalf of its trans members. The following fall, I moderated an SAA webinar on queer inclusion in archaeology that included insights from two other members of today's panel, Gabe and Sean. I wanted to thank Barb and David for the invitation to take part today. I'm very sorry that circumstances have kept me from joining the Queerest Day at the SAAs in person. I want to congratulate Guy and Sarah for making this day possible, and I'm so excited to see our work coming to such visible fruition. I'm encouraged by what this is likely to mean for the future of queer people within archaeology and for the project of queer archaeology itself. Of course, our Queerest Day comes at a time that is politically fraught, personally demoralizing, and even dangerous for some people. It can be very difficult to see or create a path forward as a queer archaeologist, particularly as a young scholar or someone who is especially vulnerable back home. Community events like this are more necessary and more important than ever. In reflecting on what I might contribute today, I kept coming back to the original visions of queer archaeology shared by Thomas Dowson and others, including our own Barb Voss, in a dedicated issue of World Archaeology some 25 years ago. Some of the pieces in that volume were primarily activist, centered on the status of queer people within archaeology as a profession. Others applied queer interpretations to or looked for queer people in the past. The special issue really relied on the balance of these two approaches. And here, as elsewhere, Tom Dowson reminded us that not all queer archaeology would be explicitly about homosexuality or gender difference. He encouraged us to think of queer as a category relative to the normative or normal, and thus a category with immense analytical and philosophical potential. Since the publication of the World Archaeology volume, scholars on either side of the Atlantic have moved on relatively separate trajectories. In Europe, people like Uroš Matic and Bo Jensen have taken a lead in queer archaeology, publishing volumes dedicated to developing queer insights on the past. Meanwhile, here in North America, most of our contributions have focused on the history and status of queer practitioners in the field. When Sean Desjardins and I sat down to revise the original QUAG Statement of Purpose in 2022, we found that the objectives were almost all related to professional issues and advocacy in the present. We decided to add a sixth objective aimed at understanding past systems of sex, gender, and sexuality. We live in a time when elected officials, funding agents, and university administrators are actively blocking anything related to sex, gender, or sexuality. But if we can't say gay, I propose we fall back on an approach that, while somewhat slower and less direct, nonetheless allows us to do something meaningful. We don't need to use the word queer to investigate past phenomena that seem to have been somehow abnormal or out of the ordinary. So what if we were to commit to an archaeology of the abnormal? And in so doing, what if we started to ask questions like, was this phenomenon abnormal in its time? Or do I just think it was because my own society considers it out of the ordinary today? Make no mistake, this is queer archaeology. Let's recommit to it. Let's teach it wherever we can, and let's share its results in as many public forums as possible. It is an approach that can be applied to everything from foodways to sex, gender, and sexuality, and one that might allow us to slowly and subtly bring the public back around to discussions that some would rather not have. For at least 25 years, politicians and members of the Supreme Court have tried to establish a national history and tradition measure for legal proposals and court cases. The Supreme Court notably relies on what the individual justices feel they know personally, rather than dedicating time to research or soliciting professional opinions. In fact, after the 2022 Dobbs decision, the major member organizations in the discipline of history issued a joint public statement that lambasted the Supreme Court for citing history and tradition without engaging in responsible historical inquiry. If we can establish the core principles of queer inquiry as a cornerstone of public intellectualism in archaeology and history, we can provide citizens with a better sense of what really is historical and traditional. Now, I recognize this proposal might sound naive, especially in a time when school textbooks are rewritten or discarded completely to present a singular, accepted, and laudatory narrative of history. But I truly believe in what I'm suggesting here. As I said, any movement we achieve will be slow and subtle. It will no doubt visibly dissenter, at least for a time, the very causes and people we ultimately hope to champion. But to be clear, what I'm proposing is a queer archaeology as a tool of intentional and strategic resistance. And I am honored to be fighting beside each and every one of you as we move this resistance forward.